What did you mean when you said you're awful as an activist?
So what I mean when I say I'm an awful activist is that every activist is an awful activist, because in order to be an activist you have to be awful to a certain extent. I mean, by definition, as an activist, you care very deeply about something that you want other people to care about, and they don't. And so you have to constantly bring this thing up, whatever it is. You have to make it known. You have to interject yourself into conversations and arguments and instances in order to be an activist, in order to raise awareness or whatever else the case might be, which is why you have, the stereotypes of the vegan who lets everybody know that they're vegan, or the atheist, perhaps a little closer to home, who lets everyone know that he's an atheist. So you have to be obsessed to a degree with something that you care about. So that's one aspect of it. You inevitably become a tiresome bore. Everything is racist, everything is sexist, and you have to point it all out, right? Or whatever it is that you happen to care about. Then there is the fact that you don't have to campaign where things are uncontroversial, right? So if you're being an activist, then generally speaking, whatever it is that you're being an activist about, you're going against the grain. You're threatening to disrupt the status quo, right? So that inevitably leads to pissing people off, particularly people who don't necessarily think, right? People who react emotionally or based on their traditional social programming or whatever else it might be. So you are inevitably going to rub people the wrong way. Also, because you can't help but be awful to a degree, the kinds of people that you tend to keep company with more and who talk about these things more with tend to be people who agree with you, right? So unless you have some kind of mechanism to get out of that bubble that you're in, your views are going to get more extreme and more out of step with everyone else over time, and you're going to get locked into this kind of internal lexicon of thoughts and concepts and ideas and peculiar uses of language, and then you try to take that and do it in the real world, and most people haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about because your language, your way of talking about things, and your right on this has spun off to such a degree and become so esoteric and strange, right? So, for example, I've gotten in two arguments the last couple of days, both relating to transgender issues. On the one hand, I am concerned that people are moving from what might be termed reasonable objections or concerns to just outright cruelty, lying, and moral panic. And on the other hand, I was advocating for the human rights of a transgender kiddie struggle cuddler. YouTube forces us into these stupid ways of putting things, but hopefully you get what I mean, right? Because so this serves as an example. Yeah, you don't need to advocate for the rights of uncontroversial people. You have to advocate for people in controversial and difficult situations. Whether you are a free speech activist defending Cradle of Filth's Jesus is a Canute shirt, or whether you're defending the rights of prisoners on death row for awful crimes or whatever. Those are the instances where you have to do it. You have to defend awful speech. You have to defend people who've done awful things, because you don't need to defend the non-controversial people, the people that everyone agrees are lovely and should be allowed to do whatever it might be, right? And so the other instance is, oh my God, think of the children, right? But all right, there are 332 million people in the United States. 300,000 or so apparently are trans-identifying teenagers, not children, teenagers. You know, that runs from 13 to 19, right? So that includes 2 years worth of adults, right? Hundreds, non-specific, out of that 300,000 have had mastectomies, most of them at ages 16 plus, 16, 17, parental permission, 18 plus, you're considered to be a competent adult, but you're still a teenager, right? And it only ever happens younger with parental consent and in a handful of extreme situations, right? With parental permission. And of those few hundreds, some handful are unhappy detransitioners. Somewhere between 1 and 8%, they reckon, of people who transition have regrets and detransition. So we're talking 4% of 0.17% of 0.09%, right? While we should have empathy and concern, and we should do what we can to help this tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people, this shouldn't be informing policy, right? And it certainly seems like most people are being helped by transitioning and so on. You can't change your sex, but you can change your gender presentation, and if it makes them feel better and cuts the suicide rate by 60 to 70%, it seems obvious that's the right thing to do, right? But this is very controversial to a lot of people, and they're very invested in the lie, and once you bring in children, many people stop thinking rationally at all. So I have had to become a tiresome bore on these two issues over the last couple of days, and so it goes for all activism. I mean, in face of the existential threat to human existence that climate change represents, almost any form of protest and activism can be justified if you truly understand how apocalyptic it is. But that doesn't mean that Just Stop Oil aren't a bunch of tossers, right? Whether their activism is effective or not, I reckon not, all told. But it is, what I mean is, it is innately inherent to being an activist that you're awful, and that seems to be inescapable.